Would your memories make a good memoir? My guest tonight is going to answer that question, so stay tuned.
Welcome to Page One, the award-winning show for writers with the reader in mind.
That draws the reader along, just like fiction.
Here's your host and producer, Zita Christian.
Hi everyone, welcome to Page One. I'm Zita Christian. My guest tonight has close to 40 years of experience as a professional writer of fiction and nonfiction. She's also a writing coach and a writing teacher. And we're going to talk tonight particularly about one type of class she's teaching. It's all about memoir. Please welcome Susan Omilian. Susan, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you.
So I know, and I should, in the interest of disclosure, should let you know, Susan and I go way back. We've been friends for a long time, met through the International Women's Writing Guild, and you were on a previous show a while back to talk about some of the other activities that you do. But I was fascinated by your work teaching memoir, so much so that I audited a class. But yes. I'm getting ahead of myself. So first, tell us the title of the class that you're teaching.
So my class is called From Memories to Memoir.
Okay, and the concept of memoir, when I think of it, begs certain generic questions, especially after a lot of things that were in the news a couple years ago. Tell me what memoir is and what it isn't.
Well, memoir is a little different than biography, I think, or autobiography. That usually means that you're telling someone's whole life, and it's like the whole chronicle of their life from the day they were born until the day something else happens. Okay. And if you're writing about somebody else, it may be a historical novel, a historical memoir, so you're really trying to dig deep into the details of their life. I think memoir is more like memory. It's more about maybe only a piece of your life, or it may be more about how you felt. Because one of the things that I think is really important when you're reading memoir or any kind of story is to understand how that person experienced that. So, for example, I've worked with a lot of men who were in battle in World War II. I have never gone to battle. I hope I will never do that. But I want to know what that experience was like, not just that they can chronicle all the facts. So I think memoir is a little more personal and a little more immediate for the reader.
I understand that, and you answered a little bit of what I want to ask, but I want you to elaborate just a little bit. Why is memoir an important type of writing for the reader and the writer?
Right. Well, for the writer, for certain, it's to get them to tell their story. I think I personally, I was a kid that was raised, I went to the library all the time, and I
did too.
Went through the bookshelves. I didn't know what I was reading. My parents didn't know a lot about literature, so I just went and picked any book. I read a lot of biographies. I got inspired by those stories. So I think memoirs are very inspiring. And sometimes they're so harrowing for the person that's writing it or the person who's the main character that you can't even imagine how this person lived through that. Yeah. But I think we read stories to be inspired. And because it's a true story, it seems even more, not more inspiring, but more human and more, fiction you can make up things. But memoir is pretty much the way it was, and you're just trying to figure out how did that person live through that, or how did that person deal with that, or how did that person, and if they can do that, I can do what I'm doing over here.
So there is that idea of there's a key to survival here.
Yes.
And inherent in the concept of memoir is the idea that what is written is true. And that said, there can be multiple truths to something, can't there?
Because I'm an attorney, I'm a trained attorney, and we'll talk about that later if we have time. I've always been fascinated by the word truth. I don't really know that there is truth. Yeah. There are facts, there are things that have happened, and then there's how each person perceives it.
Yes.
In fiction, as you know, it's called point of view. Each character has a point of view, or some characters have a major point of view and other characters don't. So really for memoir, it's, and I tell this to my students, if your sister writes the story of your childhood, it may look and sound very differently than your story of your childhood, even though you were living in the same house with the same parents and the same thing, but perception is very important. And so I think in memoir, that's what we're also reading for. I want to know what it was like to be this person in this time and space. And I think for a lot of people, particularly the seniors I've been working with, they live in a part of history. And I want to know what it was like to be in that history. And not just what it meant to be in a generic sense, but every day, what did it mean to be there? And as a woman, I know that historically, women today have a lot more rights and a lot more opportunities, but I want to know what it was like to be back in another period in time and what it was like to be a woman there.
Yeah, and how did they compensate?
Right.
How did they cope with things? What things were important to them?
Right.
How big were their dreams? I mean, there's so many things. But we are talking about because you and I have that interest, we share that interest in what was the world like for women historically. I audited your class, and one of the things
you were a very good student.
Thank you, thank you. And I had my little notebook. And everything. I loved it. One of the first things I noticed when I came into the class was that there were both women and men in the class. Is that normal for the classes you teach? Do you get men and women?
Yeah, and more so women. I think it's a propensity that women are more willing and more interested in writing. Or I shouldn't say that. They're more willing to tell the story and to emotionally be there and tell the story. Although I have a number of men, and particularly at the senior level, although women still do live longer than men, I have a number of men, I don't think they were in the class that day, who have lived through World War II, and they're in their 90s.
Yes.
And they want to write down what happened there.
Yes. And I'm so glad that you're helping them do that. That's important for everybody. Susan, when somebody comes to you and says they're thinking about signing up and taking the class, do you ask them like how much writing experience they've had? Do they have to have writing experience?
Not generally. I find, I always tell the students, and they think I'm crazy, you're already a writer when you come into this class. If you've written a letter or an email or anything,
Yes.
I can't teach you how to write. What I'm interested is how you tell in storytelling, how you tell the story. So they'll come in and say, well, I don't know how to write, and grammar and spelling. And of course, one of the things you notice in my class is I have them read out loud in the class. So
Yes.
I can't see the page. If the spelling's not right, they're going to fix that later on. It's important to get it on the page. So for me, it's really about you're a writer, you have a story to tell, you can put it on paper. Yeah, maybe it's going to come in fits and starts to begin with, but it doesn't mean that you have to be Ernest Hemingway to start writing your memoir.
Let's get a couple technical things down. The class that I audited, you were teaching at the Senior Center in Manchester, Connecticut. I know you teach other places too. So first, tell me some of the other places you teach, and I want to know, like, how often do the classes meet? How long are the classes? Talk to us about those technicalities.
I've taught at the town of Manchester Senior Center for 7 or 8 or 9 years. That's my longest running class, and there are some people in that class that actually have been there pretty much since the beginning, and then they can come in. I teach in the fall and again in January going to the spring. I just finished a semester there here in May. I've taught at a number of senior centers. I find that senior centers are a great place to talk about memoir, not just because people are available and are interested, but their stories are really rich and they're ready to write something down. Sometimes they're prodded by their kids or grandkids or whatever. I also teach adult education classes. I tend to stay away from 4-credit classes where I have to give people an A or a B or a C. That's really not of interest to me. And most of the students that come to me, they're highly motivated because they're coming in at an adult education level or a senior center. So I taught at the senior center here in South Windsor, also in Manchester, as I said. I've taught in Plainwell at the senior center. I've taught at the Bristol Wellness Center. And the interesting thing about the Bristol Wellness Center, which I taught there for quite a while, and I taught a variety of different classes, but I started out teaching journaling classes and eventually ended up with memoir, is that for some people, writing is also sort of a health kind of wellness thing.
Yes.
To begin, there's a number of research studies that say that the more you express and write, particularly write things down, you get your emotions out, you get the issues out, and that's a very good thing for your health.
I couldn't agree more. Susan, when you are teaching a class, and of course when I came, it was not the first class of the
Right.
semester. I came midway. But some of the comments that I heard made during the class lead me to ask a couple of questions, very basic. How do you teach a student where to start their story? I mean, that is such a huge question when it comes to memoir. I imagine we could do a whole show about that.
Yeah.
How do you teach them where to start? Because they're not talking, this is not, as you mentioned earlier, a biography or autobiography where we're talking the whole life. Right. We're talking a segment somewhere. How do you do that?
Well, I have sort of two tricks that I do, and I'll give them away.
Okay.
That I've learned or through experimentation. The first one is that I do a lot of work with writing prompts. I have people write from prompts, which means I give them a truncated sentence, a short sentence, or a question that they can write from, and wherever they start and wherever it takes them, it's like fine. And not to worry about spelling. It's kind of like a free write, I think we call it as writers. Okay. And the first prompt that I give them is I ask them, I think the two questions are, or the two statements are, I want to write my story because, why did you show up today? Yeah. And secondly, if I don't write my story, what will I regret, or I'm afraid that. And that sort of begins to put down on paper. Now, what I find is that people generally come in universally with the same reasons. But I want to record my family before I die, or before somebody in the family dies. I want to, have a legacy. I want to leave it for my children. I want to, review my life. All those common themes and whatever. But it also is a motivation to keep going. So now I know it's written down. It's also, I always tell them, it's the first, when you open up a book and look at the introduction to a book, usually the writer will tell you why I wrote the story, and if I didn't write the story, what I'd regret. So you already got your introduction. So I tell them, you started your book.
There you go.
You got an introduction.
That's good. I like that.
And the second thing I tell them is that, and this is really one of the techniques that I've learned you were my teacher, lots of different people I've taught and listened to. I ask them about, they want to start with their birth, and I'm not saying that's not a bad place to start, but I talk about a defining moment in their life. And so we start talking about defining moments anywhere in their life, time, and we talk about it. I draw a little line on the board, that fork in the road. Like for me, I left the state of Michigan, where I was born and raised, when I was 30 years old and came to Connecticut. That was my fork in the road. I could have stayed in Michigan and my life would have gone here, but instead it went here. And that was a defining moment for me. And so looking at those defining moments first, because they have so much energy in them, and they have so much inspiration. So yes, when I got divorced, it was a defining moment. Look what I've done now. Yes, when my mother died, it was a defining moment. Or when I started my career, and sometimes I have people that actually start at the end with the defining moment and go backwards. Like my husband recently passed away. I'm a widow now after 40, 50 years of marriage. So looking back. So I try to find that defining moment, because I believe when you read stories, that's what I learned as a fiction writer too. You start with the status quo shift, that moment when the character's life switches in some way.
Yes.
And then the reader wants to know everything. So what happened next? And what happened next? Yeah. And oh, by the way, what happened before that a little bit? Because I want to know how you got to that place. And that's when you can really begin to make a story come together.
I remember one of the students in your class. Well, let me back up a minute. One of the things I loved about your class, and you mentioned a minute ago that people read out loud, so you don't see the paper, you don't know if there's misspellings or,
right,
or spacing or typing or whatever. But I remember one woman reading something out loud, and I don't remember her name, and I may have some of the details wrong. But what I remember was that she had a story about a sister who was believed to be mentally challenged in some way, and there was an assumption on the part of the parents about how far she would be able to go in life. And then when the parents died, everything changed. Right. And what opened up for the younger sister, and being told from the perspective of the older sister, I was fascinated by that, and I sat there thinking, this is what I love about helping, that you as a teacher, helping someone uncover some part of their life, some part of the story that they might think was no big deal. In fact, from a little bit from her reaction, I thought she has no idea what a rich story she has written.
Well, it's also historic stories, how people with, I think her sister actually had a learning disability, and they had misdiagnosed her as having this big mental health issue. That's not a bad thing, it's just that they weren't really able to channel for her in her lifetime, because she's now passed away, and this is back in the, I think it was the 60s or 70s she was talking about, maybe even earlier, that her sister never had opportunities, whereas today if she would have, they would have caught that probably in grade school and began to work with her on how she functioned, and she could function in the normal world, whereas she was. But you know, it was interesting, that woman, I think I know you're talking about, she actually, you came into my class last fall, right? She had started my class that fall.
Oh my goodness.
She had started it in October. So she started picking up and I tell them it's like a jigsaw puzzle. You know, when you're writing memoir, or even fiction, but certainly memoir, you don't have to know where the story actually starts and where it ends. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. Just keep putting the pieces on the table, and then you might see the picture slowly emerge, or it might take a while to emerge, but you don't worry about, am I writing the first story first, or am I writing the last story last? And then you don't, it's like it's the right brain needs to play with it a little bit, and the left brain will come in at some point and say, okay, here's how it's going to be lined up.
Well, that exactly. Here's how it's going to be lined up. How do you, in that process you're talking about right now, how do you help them discover a theme of their memoir, and how do you say to them, based on what you've written, you could organize it by, like if I were writing my memoir, maybe jewelry, accessories. Somebody else might do it in terms of holidays or sports events.
Or cars they've owned.
Or cars they've owned.
Homes they've lived in,
So how do you help them do that?
Some of them are not really concerned about that. And I tell them, or if they are overly concerned, I'll say, the theme might emerge. And sometimes it'll emerge in a broader spectrum, like I want to write about love, I want to write about family, I want to write about injustice. I had a couple of students who have lived through the Holocaust, and they were kind of interested and amazed that when I looked at their whole life in panorama, that because they were very young when this happened to them, that social justice kept popping up in all the career choices they made and all the volunteer work. And I'm like, well, that makes sense, because you saw what the impact of people who were intolerant, people who were prejudiced at a very young age. And so however that gets into your DNA, whatever, but they couldn't see that when they first came into in fact, this one particular person has been in our group for quite a while. And one day I remember in the class we sort of came up with this idea that social justice is kind of the theme of what and it's kind of a loose theme, and I say to them it's like a little thread you can pull through your story. And sometimes it doesn't have to be a real tight thread, or sometimes you come in and you have a really clear idea of what you want to write about, and the theme is really important, or you have an idea of the theme of part of your book, part of your life. And I always tell them that many memoirs are not your entire life. I mean, one of the most recent famous memoirs is Eat, Pray, Love, with Elizabeth Gilbert, I think her name is, and she wrote about the end of her first marriage and the beginning of her second marriage. And after her first marriage fell apart, she went to Italy to eat, and India to pray, and Bali to fall in love again. And that's the end of her book. And so I sometimes say to them, maybe you have more than one book. And you don't have to have it all be sort of all tied together in a nice little knot, because the reader will get lost by that, I think.
Well, and also I think that part of the fun of writing memoir, and it should be fun, is the exploration. Is, it's like mining for gold. If you are just joining us, this is Page One. I'm Zita Christian, and my guest is Susan Omilian. She is a writing coach, a teacher, and she teaches a class on writing memoir at multiple places all over Connecticut. We're talking about a particular class that I audited, that she was teaching at the Senior Center in Manchester, Connecticut. You're going to see Susan's email multiple times throughout the show, and I just want to let you know that you can always contact her, go to her website, find out where her next classes are being taught, or contact her to teach a group that you might want to put together. And if I'm correct, do you still do individual
Yeah,
individual
I
coaching?
do individual coaching, yeah.
Okay. So there's a lot there. You mentioned a minute ago about someone wanting to say, in a broader term, I wanted to write a story about love, or I wanted to write a story about injustice. Do you find that there are common themes in the stories that men want to write and in the stories that women want to write, or is there no differentiation?
I think there's common themes, but and I always tease the guy, because I have very few men in my class, and I always tease them because, like, here's a couple of guys we're gonna like, and there's a different perception that men have about the stories they write, and not so much about what happened to them and how that felt, but what they're going to be willing to put on paper.
Oh, yes.
And so one of the things I stress really hard, and I literally hand out a whole little list of feelings, is that when you write something down, when you talk about the day you got married, or the day, this isn't my famous one, I have women write about how they met their husband or their partner. And then I have men write about how they met their wife and their partner. And the women will go, as you know, on and on about the ceremony and the dresses and the whole thing and where they met and how it felt. And the guy's like, and I met her in the bar and we talked for a while and then we got married and then we had a kid. You know, it's like, well, wait a minute, slow down.
What are the details?
You know? and it's just interesting to me. I don't even know how to describe it. But I think as human beings, we all have this, this storehouse of emotions and experiences that we want to somehow write down. I think we forget about what's intriguing to the reader about that. Like I said earlier, I want to know what it felt like to be you in that time and space.
Yes.
I want to know what it felt like to be a woman or a man. I want to know how it changed you. I want to know how it affected you, what impacts are still there, and the ability for you to, particularly if it's a difficult situation, how'd you get through it? What's that thing about resilience and persistence and patience and the idea that we do more than just survive things. We move on and we thrive, and we find a space that makes that experience fit into the rest of our life, or we go crazy. So you didn't go crazy, so what is it that you did?
Right. That's a good point. And that makes me think about that day in class when one person read and other people had the opportunity to comment. Do you find that sometimes the writer does not see what's in his or her story, doesn't see what's of real interest,
Right.
or what the pearl is, but somebody else can see it?
Right. Yeah, and I think the way I teach it, I do very, very what I call gentle critiques.
Yes.
And what the audience, what the students are invited to do is do what I do, which is to ask clarifying questions, because sometimes we're writing in first draft. A lot of this is
Right.
first draft
Oh, yeah.
material. So, is there anything that wasn't clear? How old were you in the beginning of the story? How old at the end? And then also, what's your reader's question? Because that's how, when readers read, they keep reading because there's a question that they want to have answered by the end of it. And if the question isn't presented at the beginning, you're not going to keep reading. Or if by like in a mystery story, the first chapter has to have a dead body, and the reader's question is, who did it? And if you don't know that by the end of the book, you're going to be really mad because you read this whole damn book and I don't even know the answer to that question.
Exactly.
So we talk a lot about how to set up the reader's question. I have a lot of students that come in, particularly ones who don't feel that they've lived a particularly stellar life and they're not really excited about writing this all down but their kids want it, is that they're like, my life is really boring and really stupid, and what am I going to write about? And then we start going into, okay, do a defining moment. And then we start asking readers questions. Well, I really do want to know what it was like to be you, because I didn't have that experience. And then trying to get those readers' questions to just keep the reader going, and then it keeps the writer going, because suddenly now what they've written about is kind of interesting. It was funny, I did this prompt a couple of years ago in the class, and I was reading some book about, it was a perspective from a point of view of a dog, and the whole story is in a point of view of a dog. So I came into class one day and I said, let's write some stories from our animal's point of view. And it was so much fun. In fact, one of the women continued for the next 6 months to write stories from her dog's point of view. And we actually got more intimate with the dog. So how's she doing? But you know what I mean? It's like sort of seeing things from a different perspective, and also allowing other other ways of looking at a situation and the emotional impact of it, and allowing the reader to actually guide that in some way.
I think that's an excellent approach. When I first started doing these shows, part of the reason that I had for doing them was I firmly believe that the ordinary, everyday person, the person like me, we have something that's really interesting in our lives. If we could just uncover it, and sometimes you need help to find out where that is. Susan, objections. I'm trying to think of like the objections that students might have, and you mentioned just a minute ago, my life doesn't have anything interesting. There's nothing of value. What about? And we talked earlier about I don't write, and you've answered that one. What about the objection of what will my family say? How do you help them with that?
Well, that's a big one, and one of the things that I do in the very first couple classes is I have them do an inner critic exercise, which sort of gets into that negative voice in their head, and one of that comes up big is, you don't tell family secrets.
Yes.
And so I have a couple of answers to that, depending on how blocked they are about it. First of all, I tell them, well, you don't know what you're going to write until you write it, and you can always just get rid of it.
True.
So I suggest, rather than censor as you go along, because that gets really tedious and confusing, is just write it out, And then, oddly enough, recently I've been looking at a couple of books that have like author's notes in the beginning, particularly memoirs. And I've been reading the book by Wilde, the book that became the movie.
Oh, yes.
And she had an interesting, she had a very interesting author's note. Like, there's some people in this book that I've changed the names. There's some people in this book that I did this, and some people in this book I've left out, and some people in this book I didn't change their names, and blah blah blah. And so I tell them there's some, and for some people they're only doing family stuff, only writing for their family. And then I say, in some of these things you may want to write down because nobody else is going to know them, even if they are so-called family secrets.
Very true. Susan, I want to point out, just for a quick minute here, we do have a couple books here on the set, and these are books that Susan helped her students get published. So they are collections of works of many of her students. We'll have to have you back to talk about that whole publishing process. There's a lot to be said there. But we only have about a minute or two left. Okay. And I want to ask you, what's the hardest part of the course to teach?
The hardest part of the course, I think, is when everybody gets like really anxious.
Yes.
and they're like frantic, and it's like this, this big hullabaloo, and I'm generally a pretty patient person. Every so often someone will get me a little bit like, please just sit down and be quiet and listen. But I think it's hard because they're so they want to do it so right.
Yes.
They want to be perfect. They want it to sort of say, I'm not perfect, you're not perfect, and if we can just sort of focus on what's possible right now. And people do change. The writing does get better, so it's going to be okay.
And we have to go in about just a couple seconds,
Okay.
but I have one fast question. What's the most satisfying thing for you?
Oh, the stories are fabulous.
Aren't they, though?
They're just, it's beyond fiction.
They are so rich.
Yes.
Yeah. Susan, I thank you very much
You're welcome.
for being on the show. I also want to thank those of you in the viewing audience. I want to thank my crew as well. And I love to close this show with the words of the fantasy writer Ursula Le Guin, that happens to be particularly important for tonight's show. There have been civilizations that did not use the wheel, but there have been no civilizations that did not tell stories. So find your story, find a way to tell it, and do join us again next time. Thank you.
Food for the crew and guests is provided by Manchester Grill of Manchester, Connecticut, and Angelo's Restaurant of Glastonbury, Connecticut. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email Zita at zitatv.com or write to Zita Christian, Page 1 TV, P.O. Box 1515, Manchester, Connecticut, 06045-1515. You can watch this and other episodes of Page One on youtube.com/Zita3x3.